I always feel so lucky following music. Lean on Me and Love Find the Way. It just makes it easy to get up here. So when we hear the words grief and loss, I don't know about you, but I always think of the ending of another's physical presence, the loss of another. This is the ultimate loss, right? My response when I have experienced these occasions are this tremendous tightness in my chest, tension in my muscles, free floating of my mind, a little cloudiness, tears fall rapidly. It is real and it is profound. At those times, I've been lucky enough to receive cards and flowers sometimes, and hugs, words of condolences, casseroles. And all those things serve to lighten the load. But what I've learned is that we all experience multiple losses and grief from small to grand on a regular basis, but we don't seem to mark them. So the church I used to go to, some fellow former churchgoers here, the minister, I was going regularly with my husband, the minister saw a couple come in and said, here's a match for the Tidyman Joneses. And so she introduced us, and then we set up a blind date. And it was a match made in heaven. I was no, I wasn't pregnant. I had a 1-year-old who is now 42, and she was pregnant with her first, who is now 41. So it's been a long go of it. We shared everything: adventures, tears and joys, annual ski trips, play in the snow with the kids. We were each other's children's godparents. And then 2 years ago, they moved. Still hard to say. The move was a really good decision for them, but I was devastated. My physical and mental reactions were the same as I just described. I went, oh, this feels familiar, but it's not normally what I think of in terms of grief and loss. And I didn't get any cards or flowers or casseroles. My European self, my Northern European self says, these things happen, you can get through it, this is a part of life. I hear my parents talking. But when I quieted myself and listened to my intuition or spirit or whatever you would call it, it said, you are grieving and you need to let yourself do so. Do the steps of grief. So, when I paused to acknowledge and embrace this grief, gave myself understanding, shared the story with a friend or two, and received, of course, hugs in the process, and practiced good self-care, the pain was eased, not gone, but it was eased, and I found love. There are lots of these experiences, these occasions that we are not marking. Think of leaving home for college or a job, retiring. That's huge. So many parts of grief there. Realizing that no longer will I be able to drop my Sierra cup in a creek and drink from it. Those of you who are my age understand that one. Your favorite store moving to another neighborhood. An injury that prevents you temporarily or perhaps permanently from doing what you love. relocating to another city, or a biggie, we've all had multiples of these, a breakup. The song we sang together earlier tells me to be present and engage with others when experiencing and grieving over losses and transitions. Come sing a song with me that I might know your mind, and I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in wintertime. May it be so for all of us. Amen.
Amen. In 1993, Maya Angelou, beloved sage, social justice icon, and author, wrote these words: "When I think of death, and of late the idea has come with alarming frequency, I seem at peace with the idea that a day will dawn when I will no longer be among those living in this valley of strange humors. I can accept the idea of my own demise, but I'm unable to accept the death of anyone else. I find it impossible to let a friend or relative go into that country of no return. Disbelief becomes my close companion, and anger follows in its wake. I answer the heroic question, 'Death, where is thy sting?' with, 'It is here in my heart and mind and memories.'" When my mom's mother died, it felt to my mom as if the world had ended. And in some ways it had. My mom was 19 years old the night her mother died. Alma, that was her mother's name, had suffered a stroke a few months earlier. The doctors predicted a larger and unavoidable stroke that would surely end in death. It was a waiting game. A waiting game I know that some of us have also been part of. The night it happened, my mom had been sleeping lightly, and she heard her mother call out with a slight moan that gently transformed into a sigh. By the time my mom made it to the nearby bedroom, it was over. A brain aneurysm had called her mother into the mysteries of death. My mom remembers going outside and sitting on the front steps of her house a few hours after her mom had passed. My mom always told me as a little kid, she sat there and she pulled her thin sweater tight around her in the early morning chill. It was so strange, she said. It didn't feel real. There I was, sitting there as cars drove on by on the way to work as if nothing had happened. The paper boy was coming down the street delivering the morning papers just as he always did. Everything was continuing as it always did. I wanted to scream at them, "How can you drive to work? How can you deliver the newspaper? Don't you know the world will never be the same?" My mom thought a moment, and that then continued. That was the moment I realized there are two worlds. There is the world that keeps going on, and there is the world of grief. The world that keeps on going, and there is the world of grief. The poet Chaim Stern, a celebrated rabbi, writes, It is a fearful thing to love what death can touch. A fearful thing to love, hope, dream, to be, and oh, to lose. For your life has lived in me. Your laugh once lifted me. Your word was a gift to me. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death has touched. When death touches those we love, we have no choice but to enter the world of grief. And that, dear ones, is a hard and difficult world. Margaret Montour, a dedicated Unitarian Universalist, writes, "In the throes of grief, the world doesn't make sense anymore. Just as the absence of your loved ones forces you to rearrange the physical world in some way, to clean out a closet or sell a car or change the message on the answering machine, this new absence also requires you to rearrange yourself emotionally to accommodate that loss. It sounds a bit odd to make room for the absence of someone, but that's what we do. Grief affects people in different ways. But what is so important for us all to remember is that it affects people. Grief affects us. And many of us, even if we know it's coming, aren't prepared for that impact, that long and lingering embrace of grief. Somehow, a societal message has been delivered and internalized. Cry a little, feel sad a little, then pick yourself up and get on with your life. But that isn't easy. It is never easy. Grief is a process that our body, our mind, and our spirit go through. Grief is an experience that alters our physical, emotional, and spiritual state. Our world is not the same. I want to share just a little of what the world of grief can do to us. Some of us know this world well. Others of us know that world is coming at some point. Much of what I will share is taken directly or adapted from materials provided by the Center for Grief and Healing. And as Laurie had talked about earlier so beautifully, much of what I'm going to share can be true for many kinds of losses other than death, from the loss of a job to the loss of a dream, the loss of a relationship, a divorce, loss brought by illness, loss brought by our aging, by our loss of mobility, our loss of hearing. One that I know touches many of us in this space, the loss of a loved one to dementia. Their body is with us still, but where are they? The loss brought on by our own cognitive decline. Much of what I'm going to share is true for those kinds of loss other than death. But with a death, we usually feel these things most acutely. So this is just a little bit that grief can do for us. Grief can put us in a state of disbelief. It can be hard to accept what happened. Sometimes we try to deny it, or we feel numb or just in shock. We may expect to see our loved one even though we know that that person isn't there. Sometimes we think we do see them in the street, in the hallway. the store, and we sometimes hear their voices. Grief can also make us feel guilty. We regret things we might have said or done or failed to do or say. We feel guilty for being the one who remains. Grief can also cause physical problems. We may feel physically different, a tightness in the throat or a heaviness in the chest or in the pit of the stomach that just doesn't go away. We may have shortness of breath. We may have a loss of appetite or the desire to eat more than usual. I found myself putting on close to 40 pounds in the year after my mom's death. Eating was a way to fill that empty place that I was feeling inside of me. We also might feel restless or constantly looking for activity just to keep us busy, or we feel exhausted, fatigued. We may find it really hard to concentrate on and complete tasks. Our brain just doesn't work. It's like we're in a fog. We may have difficulty sleeping. We wake up in the middle of the night, or we might just want to sleep all the time. And then often our digestive system just goes completely out of whack. We get sick. We have less ability to fight off illness. Grief can also cause depression. And for those of us who live with depression as a daily reality, it can threaten to plunge us into a deeper depression. Depression is often a part of grieving, but depression is different than feeling sad. Many grieving people feel total despair, unbearable loneliness and hopelessness. Nothing seems worthwhile. These feelings, if they come, are normal. But if they come, or if they remain for a period of time, it's so important to seek out professional help. Talk to your doctor. Seek out a therapist. Medication is essential for many of us when we are living with depression. And let us gently remember that. Medication is a gift for many of us who are living through depression. Grief can also make us feel fearful or just overwhelmed. Death often causes some of us to face our own fears about dying, while others of us fear going on with life without our loved one. Others of us are just completely overwhelmed by all the new responsibilities, paying bills, arranging financial and household affairs, downsizing, selling a house, or making simple day-to-day decisions. And dear ones, more than anything, perhaps we fear the unknown that is before us. Grief can also make us angry. Some may feel angry at our loved one for having deserted us. That's natural. Others may feel a need to blame someone. We lash out. Hostility, and hear this, hostility is a real way we express grief. This is true for all genders, but I want to point out that anger is one of the key ways many men grieve. In our Western culture that doesn't encourage vulnerability or anguish in males, grief often gets channeled by men into anger. Outbursts, road rage, yelling, verbal attacks, sarcasm, impatience. These are often ways men release grief. I remember being downright nasty to my husband for several months after my mom died, not really understanding till later what was happening to me. I had so much grief inside me, and one way, unfortunately, I could release it was through anger. Luckily, he understood and waited for that time when I could say, I'm so sorry. And grief can also make us withdraw. We often pull back from our social relationships. We isolate. We step away from community at a time when we need community the most. And dear ones, grief can make us feel like we're losing our sanity. Margaret Montour writes, you wake up in the morning, and for one brief moment, all is well, and then you remember, and all the colors drain from the world around you. You feel out of control, like you're losing your mind. This is a normal and reasonable response to grief. Eventually, that madness subsides, and in its place is some acceptance of a new reality. It's not a straight line to that calmer place, and it takes more time, Margaret says, than most of the books will ever tell you. Sometimes it takes a lot more time. That's okay, Margaret says. You're okay. Margaret Montour writes, grief brings uneven emotions which seem to come and go. Some days are going to feel so good, while the next day or even the next minute and seemingly out of nowhere, we feel intense sadness. This is normal. On the first anniversary of my mom's death, I found myself completely overcome. I thought I was done with my acute grieving, but I had to cancel a family trip to Florida because I couldn't will myself to get out of bed. I could not will myself to get to the airport. I literally was in bed on my cell phone telling my dad, I can't come, you have to go yourself. I felt like I lost my mind. Grief can and will linger. Grief shifts and changes in form and intensity, but I don't think it ever completely goes away. But we can, through time and through our choices, find life again. Anne Murphy Fletcher writes, you can be healing and scarred. I like that, and I think we should hold on to it. We can be healing and be scarred at the same time. We can be healing and scarred. This next one is really important for us to remember. New grief can and will trigger past grief. When we experience a loss, it reaches back and reopens all our previous losses. We grieve those older losses again, along with the new loss. This cumulative grief is part of why loss can be so overwhelming the longer we live. When my friend's mother died recently, he wasn't just grieving her death. He was feeling again the loss of his dad 5 years ago, and the loss of his younger brother 9 years ago, and the death of his best friend in high school 45 years ago. So much cumulative loss, alive again once more. Margaret Montour writes, as time passes, you still grieve, but with less intensity. And if you're lucky, like I am, you have the pleasure of good memories interwoven with your sadness. But you can expect that sense of acute grief to recur, even years or decades later. She writes, at my nephew's high school graduation, the fact that my sister did not live to see that day put me right back in that place of intense sorrow. I missed her for me, but I missed her more for her husband and children, and I never saw that coming. Lastly, the loss of a pet or an animal companion can bring profound grief. I have a friend who said they managed fairly well when their two siblings died in the same year. But when Lucky Face, their 10-year-old Cocker Spaniel, died, they experienced a shattering grief, a grief that they were then ashamed of because we live in a society that rarely acknowledges the depth of relationship that we can experience with an animal. Society doesn't give us shared rituals to mark the loss of a pet. And so we're left alone and isolated in our unspoken grief. But that grief, that loss, is so deep. It is so real. How grief impacts us is different for each of us. But one thing is true for all of us. We need not walk through the world of grief on our own. Loneliness and solitude are part of grief, but they are not its sum total. Grief is too much to hold alone. Grief is too much to handle on our own. There are friends, there are loved ones, there are counselors and mental health professionals. Thank God and Goddess for mental health professionals. There are authors who have penned their own stories about surviving grief, and those books invite you into their world. There are grief support groups, and I cannot say it enough how important a grief support group can be. For years, I recommended that members of my congregation go to a grief group. When my mom died, I was like, darn, I have to go to a grief group. And thank God I did. It was a magnificent healing experience. There's minister. They're trained members of this church who are on a Caring Hearts team. And for some of us, depending how we make meaning in the world, there is higher power, God, the Spirit of life. In the end, our grief is our own, but our grief cannot be lived through alone. We need one another when we grieve and would be comforted. We need love. We need to know that there is a love holding us. There's a love holding all that we love. There's a love holding all. As we often sing, we rest in this love. The morning my mom died, I was with her in her hospice room. I watched her release her final breath, let go, and pass into the mysteries of death. In that moment, just as my mom did on the morning of her own mother's death, I too realized there are two worlds. There is the world that keeps on going, and there is the world of grief. What brings these two worlds together, what brings us back together, is love. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.